Thank you all for standing by, and welcome to the third webinar of our spring series entitled Framing Climate Change, Recent Research Trends on Communication Strategies and Public Opinion. These webinars are an initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university led by Ohio State University Extension, Ohio Sea Grant, Bird Polar Research Center, and 6 other OSU departments to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lakes residents. I'm Ann Baird from Ohio State University Extension in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. Joining me today is Dr. Erik Nisbet. Erik is with the School of Communication and Department of Political Science at The Ohio State University. Erik is an assistant professor of communication and political science. His research interests center on how unconscious biases and selective media consumption can influence public opinion about science and environmental policy. We're really delighted to have Erik here today. But before we get on with his presentation, a few logistical issues to get us started. First of all participants will be in listen-only mode. Around 12:40, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to do so at any time using the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. I will collect and pose your questions to Erik at the end of his presentation. We have more than 500 participants registered on this webinar, a really diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, nonprofit groups from the Great Lakes and around the country. Please keep those questions coming throughout the presentation, and we should have a great question and answer session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey too. It will help us continue to bring you better webinars. As a reminder, if you are taking this webinar for Ohio Continuing Professional Development Credit, there will be a separate small survey to complete your registration. See the chat box for details. Without any further delay, I'll turn it over to Erik.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my webinar today. We are going to be talking about 3 topics today related to communicating and understanding climate change. My agenda for today, first is to review the state of public opinion about climate change, looking at some recent polls to give it sort of a context for our discussion. Then I would like to talk about some of the main explanations for the public opinion trends and status of climate change understanding in the United States, and go over those and basically understand the communication implications of these explanations. And then lastly, I want to talk about some emerging strategies for communicating about climate change to the public. Different researchers have been approaching this from different perspectives, and based upon some of the research that has been conducted in the field as well as here at OSU, we can talk about some of the ways that scientists and advocates and government professionals and others could possibly communicate about the nature and impacts of climate change. So let's start off talking about, well, how does the public think about climate change? How do they feel about climate change? Gallup has been tracking worry about global warming for almost 20 years now. As you can see, there is some variation. And there was the height of worry sort of was in 2 parts. One was in the late 1990s, where we had a lot of discussion over the Kyoto Treaty. And then more recently, starting around 2006, with the premiere of Inconvenient Truth and a lot of media coverage about climate change. However, what you saw is a dip in the recent years, coinciding with the economic recession, which we'll talk about a little bit, and where you see basically worry about climate change is pretty much down about 50% of the public, though it's seen a bit of an uptick most recently. Well, beyond people worrying about climate change, do people believe it's happening? If it's happening, what is the cause? And if you look at the public opinion tracked by Pew since 2006, and this 2011 survey was conducted in late November 2011, so it's about 6 months old, you can see that there was about 2/3 of the public currently believe that climate change is happening, though that is split, with about 40% believe that's due to human causes, another 20% roughly believing it's due to natural patterns. All right. What you've seen here is a dip in the overall percentage of the public that believe that climate change is happening since the height in 2006. And what you've seen is an increase in the sizable increase in the number of the public that believe it's not happening. So what you've seen recently in the last few months is above a few changes, but not too significantly. At the same time, you could say about the same percentage believe that global warming is a serious problem. About 38% of the public believe that's very serious, and about 27% believe it's somewhat serious. Beyond these overall patterns, though, what you see is definite political polarization between the public in terms of partisanship. So Democrats are much more likely to believe that climate change is happening, and that there's solid scientific evidence of global warming compared to Republicans. Though both Democrats and Republicans, the percentage of Democrats and Republicans have decreased since 2006. So about almost 3/4 of Democrats believe that climate change is happening and there's solid evidence of such, compared to only about 40% of Republicans. And what you have is about 2/3 of independents believe there is solid evidence for global warming. So there's definitely a political divide, but it's interesting to show that all three groups, regardless of political ideology and orientation, have seen a dip in belief that there's solid evidence of global warming since 2006. That was Pew data. Gallup also sort of tracks this poll, and it's somewhat different question wording, so it's hard to compare Pew and Gallup directly to each other. But what's more importantly here, again, to see sort of similar trends. What you see here in sort of the height of belief that climate change is due to human activities was in 2007, and it's gone down appreciably since then, about 9 points. And you've seen an increase in the percentage of people that believe it's due to natural causes since that time as well. So there's about a 10-point gap between those who believe it's due to human activities and natural causes where we stand now in 2012. And this survey was actually just completed a couple months ago. Well, what about scientific consensus? There's been a lot of talk about ClimateGate, about whether scientists really, have a strong consensus about climate change or not. There's different perspectives you see in the political discourse in the media, even though, according to the United Nations and the IPCC report, and by all indicators, there is a clear scientific consensus that global warming is occurring, but is that same perception shared by the public? And what you find is that most believe, about 60% of the public believe that there is a scientific consensus, all right, compared to about the other roughly third that believe that scientists are unsure, that there is no scientific consensus about climate change. So about a third believe in scientific uncertainty, and about almost 2/3, 60%, believe in scientific uncertainty, with a small number, 7%, unsure. All right. Obviously, the belief that there's a scientific consensus is associated with belief that climate change is occurring. Though many believe that climate change is happening and that it is human-induced, actually a majority of the public, almost 2/3, believe that it's a future threat, that they don't believe that global warming will actually pose a serious threat in their lifetime, all right, compared to about 40% that do. So though we can say that a majority of the public actually sort of accept the fact that climate change is happening, they really don't think it threatens them now or even in their present lifetime. So that really reduces the immediacy of the threat in terms of motivation to deal with the issue. Not only do they think that climate change is sort of a future threat and something that's not going to impact them directly in their lifetime, relative to other environmental threats or environmental worries, it's pretty low on the list. This is a survey taken from a year ago in March 2011, though if you look at this survey data over time, it's pretty consistent in terms of how people rank different environmental worries or threats. As you can see that global warming is far down at the bottom of the list. So though 50% of Americans report worrying about climate change to a great deal, fair amount, that pales in comparison to worries about pollution in rivers, lakes, and reservoirs, water quality, the contamination of soil from toxic waste. These are the environmental threats and worries that really drive public concern and motivate policy discourse in terms of environmental terms. So really, we can talk about climate change and global warming as this sort of overall global threat to the environment and to society, but in terms of what people are actually worrying about on a day-to-day basis, it's far removed compared to these other environmental worries. So in sum, what do these different polling data tell us? Well, it tells us that there is a sizable proportion of Americans, between 40 to 50%, depending on the poll and the question wording, that believe that climate change is happening and is due to human causes in some ways, due to human-induced climate change through carbon emissions, for example. And about almost two-thirds of Americans believe it's happening and that there's a scientific consensus. All right. So though there might be more polarization about whether climate change is human-induced, is due to human causes or not, there is sort of two-thirds of Americans, that's the upside, do believe it's actually occurring, and do believe that there's scientific consensus that it is occurring. So obviously these perceptions vary greatly across, whether you are a Democrat or Republican or independent. Right? Half of Americans do worry about global warming in some way in a significant manner, but as those other polling data show, most do not believe it's actually going to impact them in their daily life today. It's not an immediate threat, nor rate it highly compared to other forms of environmental issues or threats. So though global warming is on the radar, other types of environmental issues take precedence in the American psyche. Well, what are some possible explanations for these public opinion trends and the political polarization we see about climate change? Why is there such skepticism about climate change, about especially whether it's human-induced or not, and such a reluctance from the public to tackle this issue, both among politicians and the public at large? Right? Well, there are different explanations that scholars and pundits and policymakers have put forth, and I want to talk about four sort of influences on public opinion that are often cited both in research and discourse, and talk about how they may be influencing public opinion trends about climate change, and then what are some of the implications for how we communicate about climate change to the general public, how to address these sort of possible explanations and barriers to informing and motivating the public about this issue. Well, first is sort of the economic explanation, right? If you look at, Gallup again has been polling the public on what is more of a priority, protecting the environment or focusing on economic development and growth, for example. And what you can see is that for most of the 80s and 2000s and 1990s, you saw that the environment was a priority over economic development. Though starting in 2000, you see these trends starting to converge, where you had the initial economic recession in 2001, 2002, and 2003 at the beginning of the Bush administration. And then what you really have beginning in 2008 is the Great Recession, as it's been come to call, where we've had such a reduction in employment and economic growth, in some cases not seen since the Depression, where you really see these two trend lines cross, where economic development has become more of a priority than the environment overall. And many argue this has really impacted how people look at trade-offs, especially when you look at should we invest in carbon taxes or cap and trade that might retard economic growth for potential future environmental savings as a public good and to help protect the environment and deal with global warming. And so this overall trade-off of environment versus economics definitely impacts how people view climate change and climate mitigation policies. One other thing of note is you do see a blimp where you see environmental concern did go up in about 2010, and that was really related to the BP oil spill and all the media focus and concern about its impact on the Gulf Coast at that time. This is another set of data, again illustrating the same set of relationships, where you see what you're charting here in the bars are the unemployment rate compared to survey respondents from Pew regarding different priorities. So you can see there's an inverse relationship between jobs as a top priority and the unemployment rate, and again, the environment being a top priority for the public. Okay? You also see in 2007, Pew started polling about global warming as a top priority, and what you see in response to unemployment going up and concern about jobs going up, especially in 2008, you see basically the number of Americans citing the environment as a top priority and global warming as a top priority take significant dips. Beyond the economy and economic trends influencing people's willingness to address environmental problems like global warming and make sort of economic versus environment trade-offs, another source of opinion formation or influence on public opinion about climate change has been media coverage about climate change. And research has shown various different content analyses conducted by academic scholars has tracked a rise in overall media attention to climate change over the last 10 to 15 years. And for example, what you see is a large increase since the early 1990s, though with some variability depending on external events. For example, in 1997, you had Kyoto negotiations. The Clinton administration started in the late 1990s to focus on environmental and climate issues and sort of promote them to the Democratic base, their activities on this. And again, you see pick up in 2006 with the premiere of Inconvenient Truth and Al Gore making climate change and global warming one of his main sort of communication efforts. So this sort of increase in coverage towards climate change has plateaued in the last couple years, as this graph shows here, though again the Copenhagen meetings and Obama going to Denmark to try to negotiate a climate treaty did increase the attention given to climate change in many mainstream media outlets. For example, this is looking at articles in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN.com, and Politico, and looking at articles across these media outlets in terms of mention of climate change. You do see small bumps and dips depending on events, but overall, unless you have this huge sort of focusing event like Copenhagen, it has plateaued overall, media coverage. Well, how has climate change been represented in the media? You've had increased coverage over the last 10 or 15 years, though a plateau in recent years, except for focusing events. Well, multiple studies have shown that the false balance effect, whereas the skeptics or denialists of global warming or human-induced global warming are given fair and equal treatment, especially in terms of scientific arguments compared to scientific arguments or scientific evidence regarding global warming and climate change. And what you see is the amount of fair balanced coverage has actually significantly decreased. This is just from 2003 to 2006, where it went from almost over a third of media coverage basically gave a balanced count of whether it's sort of natural cycle versus human-induced or human-caused climate change, to where it's only about 3% of media coverage in 2006. So you basically have seen this shift in how the media has come to accept that global warming is occurring and how it's talking about the issue and that it is caused by human activity. This is some more recent data that again shows the same type of trend, looking at those same media outlets before, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Times, Politico, CNN, where you see overall the consensus view, the scientific consensus view, that climate change is happening and that it's human-induced, is represented in the majority of media content, a large majority of media content in 2009 and 2010, where the exceptions are you see spikes in the false balance views in around Copenhagen and, in late 2009, 2010, where you had two things going on. One, Copenhagen and ClimateGate, where the political aspects of this story were increased significantly unless there was more air given to climate denialists and skeptics in the media coverage. But even in those cases, over 70% of the media coverage communicated the scientific consensus about climate change occurring and being human-induced. However, if you look at, there are some sources of media, some aspects of media that remain contentious. Cable news, for example, still has clear differences between channels and how they communicate climate change. And what you see here is that MSNBC and CNN are much more accepting of the scientific consensus, again, over 70% of their coverage that global warming is occurring and human-induced, compared to Fox. And conversely, Fox is more dismissive of scientific claims and scientific evidence on this regard. So though mainstream newspapers, network TV, and outlets like NPR, for example, have sort of come to communicate the scientific consensus and implications of climate change, very partisan outlets, for example on cable, remain rather contentious. Though, to be fair, cable audiences are still relatively small compared to the media universe as a whole. Fox, for example, though it is the most popular cable station, still its viewership is relatively small. You're talking 2 to 3 million viewers on any one evening out of a population of over 300 million people. So though they're very partisan and politically oriented, it's still a small audience compared to the overall media audience in general. Many scientists and commentators and science advocates and others have been very concerned about the implications and consequences of the so-called ClimateGate, and whether the release of emails and sort of inside discussions of British scientists about their research and their approach to climate science has maybe increased negative opinions about whether climate change is occurring or not, has led the public to call into question climate science, for example, and conclusions from climate science, and has led to sort of negative framing about climate change in the mainstream media. And what the research has shown, for the most part, in terms of looking at the content analysis, is that the ClimateGate story made a very small blip on the overall media landscape. Both Pew and the Climate Shift Report at American University found very, very little mainstream coverage of ClimateGate compared to the overall coverage about climate change. So as a percentage of the overall media coverage dealing with global warming and climate change, it was actually a very small percentage and limited to really to that time frame without not really a long-term leg. Okay. So, the implications is that ClimateGate did not significantly influence media coverage of climate change overall or in the long term, either in the short term or the long term. Where ClimateGate did make an impact was really sort of in blogs and social media. There is definitely in the blogosphere a community of what you call skeptic or denialist blogs that question climate science, question whether climate change is actually occurring and whether it's human-induced. And what you saw that in terms of, this is from Pew, around ClimateGate in 2009, you saw a large increase in blogosphere stories and comments among blogs about global warming. About a year later or so, again, you saw a similar uptake in the blogosphere, but instead of it being in response to a leaked information from climate skeptics, it was actually the American Geophysical Union putting together 700 scientists and making a statement supporting climate science and the conclusions of climate science about human-induced climate change. And that also saw an increase. So you really have this sort of back and forth among these community of bloggers and on the online sort of sphere about climate change. That's where a lot of this discussion about climate science and claims about ClimateGate or other types of back and forth is occurring. But to be clear, it doesn't really hit the mainstream media, and only about 10% of Americans regularly get their news from blogs. And the number of people, Americans as a percentage, who are actually then reading these specific blogs is pretty small. So you really have sort of bubbles of advocates, skeptics, scientists online either talking to each other or possibly talking to each other, but it's not necessarily impacting larger public perceptions about climate change either directly through people reading these blogs, and there isn't evidence that has significantly influenced how media covered climate change in terms of whether it's human-induced or not and whether it's occurring or not. Another aspect of the story, the media coverage, is whether claims about climate change are exaggerated media claims. And we all know that the media tend to sensationalize news stories. If there's not conflict, if there's not drama, not sensationalism, the media don't necessarily think it's interesting to report on. Or they might actually, in the way what frames and cues and people they choose to interview, decide to hype certain aspects of a story, and especially when it comes to something like environmental risks, more so than talking about what we actually know and the certitude and, what are the actual risks versus the potential risks. And some have talked about how this media hype and exaggeration have possibly led to Americans thinking that the media are hyping the risks from climate change and that are over-exaggerating the issue. And you see that there are significant proportions of the public that feel this way, though there's obviously a partisan divide, where Republicans are more likely to think that global warming is exaggerated in the news. Independents, about 40%, believe that so, and still 20% of Democrats feel that way. So though there's a partisan divide, there are significant portions of all three political groupings that believe that the media in some way exaggerate global warming. And I believe, in my opinion, This exaggeration is partly due to how global warming has been framed, both by the media focusing on disaster frames. The sort of iconic image now of the polar bear looking over sort of the ice precipice, and the polar bear representing us, looking into the, possibly drowning, in climate change. Or the idea that somehow we need a survival guide to deal with the coming apocalypse. Or that basically, the earth is being fried, much like, the iconic drug commercials, that this is your brain on drugs. The same image is being used to basically look at the earth and then us in terms of global warming. And many, advocates and communicators about climate change, environmental groups and others, have often talked about climate change in terms of environmental disaster, whether it's hurricanes, whether the impact on plants and animals in the biosphere. And when we do that, it does draw attention to the issue. It does often motivate audiences, but it often also causes other audiences to believe such claims are exaggerated or dismiss such claims, especially when the so-called disaster is far off, it has not immediately happened. You can sort of have this boomerang effect where then information that's provided, new information or future communication that may be more nuanced, is then taken and dismissed more readily. So really often when we talk about climate change and we use what we call fear or disaster frames, we have to be careful in what context that we're communicating it and not to actually overstate our claims or the risk, because then our credibility in terms of future communication can be diminished. A third explanation regarding perception gaps about climate change is that it's an issue of a lack of knowledge. This is often called the scientific deficit model. And the scientific deficit model assumes that if we increase knowledge among the public as a whole, that will create consensus that's in line with scientific thinking. That basically the reason why there's such controversy and since discord regarding certain types of scientific policies or issues like global warming is that there's simply a lack of knowledge and understanding among the public as a whole. And by closing these gaps, we can actually address the problem. Unfortunately, the research shows that's not the case, if it was only that easy. All right? That, yes, attacking sort of deficits, information deficits, often works with only a small percentage of the public, those that are most interested in the issue, that have the greatest education or cognitive ability to process and retain information, and it really ignores the complexity of opinion formation about policy. All right? That often there's many other factors that go beyond simple knowledge or facts that basically shape people's attitudes, especially about a complex, long-term, a multifaceted issue like global warming and climate change. If you look at what the actual distribution of knowledge about climate change is among the American public, we see sort of a normal sort of bell-shaped distribution where the mean is around, or at least the median is around a C, all right, which is a passing grade, but not a great grade. This is based upon Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, does a series of surveys periodically each year. It's a wealth of public opinion data and tips on how to communicate climate change. And they basically did sort of this knowledge test of 81 factual questions about climate change and basically then graded the American public based upon the accuracy of their answers. So only 2% of Americans get an A, which is rather low. A third get a B, which isn't so bad. And then we have basically 27% of Americans that get D or an F. Right? So that at least there is some moderate understanding of climate change, though it is low among the general public. So it isn't that the public is totally unawares. It just would not basically, if you're happy with the C, so be it, but it's not a great grade. Well, sort of the alternative to the scientific deficit model in terms of understanding public opinion about a complex issue is sort of thinking about people as cognitive misers. One of the critiques of the scientific deficit model is that people often lack the motivation or the ability to actually systematically and deliberately think about a complex scientific issue like global warming, right? People are working, they don't have the time, they don't have the education, they don't have the opportunity to basically know about all the different political, social, and economic issues going on around them, and they have to focus in on those things which are most relevant and salient to them. And because we are cognitive misers, even when we don't realize it, we often focus on a range of heuristics, or otherwise known as mental shortcuts, when we make decisions about complex issues. Now, these mental shortcuts can come in a variety of types. That might be relying upon our ideological and value predispositions, or cues and messages that somehow align with our value and ideological predispositions. It might be based upon our perceived trust and credibility in certain sources of information, or scientists, or political actors, or religious leaders, or other leaders in our community who we see as authoritative and credible. We might use how we feel, emotional cues, whether it's in messages, in speeches, or how we basically feel about the fear and risk and worry about climate change. It might be group-centric cues. We might identify with certain groups based upon political, ethnic, social, class-type dimensions, and if we feel our group feels this way, we want to belong to the group unless we basically use sort of mental shortcuts about how the group feels as a whole that are communicated to us to form our own decision about this issue. Or we might use interpretive frames, which are sort of schemas, packages, schemas that basically package different issues, tell us what's relevant, tell us what is at stake, often diagnose a problem, and also then provide a prognosis of how to deal with the problem as mental shortcuts to help organize complex information. So, depending on the context, the situation, and the issue, we might rely on different types of mental shortcuts rather than making sort of deliberative and systematic evaluations of an issue like climate change. So part of this is that we work backward. A lot of research in political science, political psychology, talks about motivated reasoning. And the concept here is that we work backward from our strongly held pre-existing beliefs. We use our values and beliefs, all right, as our starting point. So if we have a strong belief in climate change or not, then we basically sort out the evidence to support that belief, all right? We don't like to feel distressed where we basically are exposed to information that calls into question what we think we know or what we feel or what we value in terms of ideology or morals. Often it's called reason infused with emotion. We have emotional reactions. They happen quicker and faster than any type of logical reactions to information. And these emotional reactions color how we attend to and process information. Now, this might seem irrational, but no, it isn't. It's actually very irrational, that you can be both rational and subjective, in the sense of you might be making rational decisions based upon the subjective interpretations of information. So it might seem rational to us based upon our values and our interpretations, whether it might seem irrational to someone else, and vice versa. So motivated reasoning is a way, a theoretical framework to understand how strongly held beliefs and values shape our interpretation of knowledge and information to which we expose or learn from a variety of sources. Thus, values and ideologies act as perceptual screens through selective exposure, different types of sources of information, paying more or less attention to different aspects of the same message, assimilating some information in a message, some facts, and not others, and also processing messages in a biased way. We might dismiss certain messages. We might counter-argue certain messages. So all these processes that are basically motivated by reducing our emotional distress actually lead to us coming up with conclusions that reinforce our strongly held beliefs or values. You see this in how different ideologies process information about climate change. This is a poll from a few years ago. Basically, we can see that liberals and moderates as knowledge about climate change increases. This is the answers to 5 different factual questions. The likelihood of believing that climate change is occurring and caused by humans increases, but then among conservatives that doesn't matter. It does not. Basically, conservatives do not really see a large increase in the likelihood of believing that climate change is happening the more they know about climate change. So in this way, ideology acts as a perceptual screen, diminishing the impact of knowledge on public opinion. Again, this sort of goes into this critique of the scientific deficit model. Even if everyone was educated about climate change, there still see these gaps between liberals, moderates, and conservatives. The idea is that we all do this. Some recent authors, like Chris Mooney's book, argues that Republicans and the Republican brain is somehow naturally antithetical to scientific reasoning, and that Republicans somehow engage in motivated reasoning around scientific issues more so than liberals or Democrats. And unfortunately, this research's interpretation is really incorrect. Both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, employ motivated reasoning to make sense of complex scientific issues. Chris Mooney's book, though he does summarize the theory of motivated reasoning well, his conclusions in saying that somehow Republicans and conservatives are antithetical to scientific issues is sort of the wrong conclusion. He is an author and liberal blogger, very much a science advocate, but if you look at some of the other research, for example, Jonathan Haidt, there's a book out which I definitely recommend reading, argues many of the similar mechanisms and issues as Chris Mooney, but he basically points out that we use our values and moral reasoning, whether it's nuclear power for liberals or climate change for conservatives, we all use our values and ideologies, perceptual screens across the political spectrum. Kahan at Yale has a recent blog post looking at cultural cognition research that basically demonstrates the same thing. So there's definitely pushback against this perspective. Well, the research shows that values can impact our scientific credibility, and I know we're running out of time here, so I'll go quickly through some of this research so that I have time for questions. But, some research by Kahan and his colleagues that's in press did an experiment where they had participants read a book excerpt written by a scientist. And they basically manipulated whether the expert argued risk of climate change was either high or low. And then, depending on how they argued, the same expert with the same background, the same person supposedly, but if different people saw whether the scientist was arguing for high-low risk, they wanted people to rate how trustworthy they saw the book's author. And they did this for other types of risks as well. And what they found was, depending on your value orientation, all right, and whether the argument was consistent with your value orientation, people perceived differently whether the expert was credible or not. So those who agreed with the expert, all right, that it was a high risk for global warming, when the expert high risk, actually perceived it more credible, and those versus those who disagreed with the expert perceived them as less credible. And you see the reverse for the other types of value orientations, more conservative value orientations. When the same expert valued that there was low risk, they saw the expert as credible, and the more liberal respondents perceived them as less credible. So whether you're on the left or the right, or on these different value orientations, as Kahan sort of shows, they actually impact perceptions of scientific credibility across the spectrum. A study I did with a colleague at American University did another study where we looked at the health impacts of climate change. And what we did was we communicated whether climate change was going to impact local farmers or not in terms of West Nile virus. And we manipulated the perceived social distance. We talked about in-group farmers versus out-group farmers. And we tested whether political partisanship, whether you're Democrat or Republican, influenced whether you perceived more or less social distance between you and the potential victims of climate change. And what we found, what we hypothesized, is that political partisanship would influence how much you identify with potential victims. That Democrats would identify more and Republicans would identify less. And this identification, in turn, would influence whether you support climate mitigation or not. All right? And what we found, okay, great. I see that we can go until 1:30. So if I go past 1, you can. Okay. So I'll try to hurry up here. I'm sure many of you have some good questions, and I'm looking forward to them. But what we found is a boomerang effect. What we actually found was that when we communicated about outgroup, sort of the high social distance condition, that Republicans were actually less supportive of climate change. When we talked about health impacts of climate change, then the Republicans received no message. So simply communicating about climate change and talking about climate change that's going to impact people unlike themselves actually increased opposition to climate mitigation. All right? Among Democrats, it didn't make a difference. Whether you're part of the in-group or out-group, you perceived low or high social distance, they supported climate mitigation no matter what, based upon the health impact story we gave them. So what we found is that both Democrats and Republicans use motivated reasoning to form opinions about how much they identify with the potential targets of a climate change, the potential health impacts, where Democrats identified more with farmers, no matter who they were, where Republicans identified less, and this identification then influenced attitudes. So we actually, in some ways, increased opposition to climate change among Republicans when we communicated health impacts, especially when we communicate about health impacts about people outside their local community. I also want to show, again, that misperceptions can drive opinion, again, on both sides of the ideological spectrum. We did a survey where we asked true-false statements about 6 factual questions regarding climate change. And were more likely to answer that these were true, that record snowstorms in the winter prove that global warming is not happening, that climate often changes from year to year, and there's a great deal of disagreement among scientists about whether global warming is happening or not. These are all conservative misperceptions that conservatives are more likely to believe than liberals or moderates, with some demographic controls thrown in for our analysis. But we also found liberal misperceptions. Liberals more likely to believe that the hole in the ozone layer is the primary cause of global warming. And we're more likely to believe that if we stopped burning fossil fuels today, we would see and reduced our emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, we would see an immediate impact, and that the Earth's climate is warmer now than it's ever been before. Both these sets of misperceptions, all right, are consistent with conservatives supporting climate mitigation and believing, liberals supporting climate mitigation and believing in human-induced climate change, and conservatives believing the opposite. Basically, they believe these misperceptions because they're consistent with their strongly held beliefs about global warming and their sort of ideological orientations. They're motivated to believe these fallacies, both liberals and conservatives. And what you see is that the more attention that they pay to news, for example, among liberals, the more likely you are to believe liberal misperceptions. So if you look at the interaction between liberals, ideology, and attention to news, what you find is the more attention that liberals pay to the news, the more likely they are to believe these misperceptions. Thus, they're picking up this information, they're picking out information they believe is consistent with their ideology and deciding to assimilate that through biased processes and dismiss information which is not consistent with their ideology. Conservatives are doing the same. Again, the more attention conservatives pay to news, the more likely they're to have conservative misperception. All right? So the idea is that both liberals and conservatives might be paying attention to the same content, but they're selecting out from that content information which is consistent with their pre-existing beliefs. Again, they're working backward. This is the argument of motivated cognition and reasoning. So, what to do about this issue? How do we address this problem? How do we address these issues of motivated reasoning and values shaping attitudes about climate change and global warming, regardless of the knowledge context, etc. Well, framing is one way that people make sense of issues, and one way you can communicate issues. It's based upon classic research by Kahneman and Tversky that showed through loss-gain frames that perception is reference-dependent. That perception of issue is based upon the reference, your starting point. So whether you perceive losses or gains is dependent upon the information and context that you're initially given. Gamson and Modigliani, sociologists, also sort of applied this framework for understanding nuclear power back in 1989. And they looked at different types of interpretive packages, how nuclear power as an issue was basically packaged by the media and by advocates on both sides. And that's arguing that frames serve this context or central organizing ideas. They basically give the public a sense of what is relevant, what is at issue, what is at stake, what values or considerations are most relevant for deciding about an issue. It's highlighting and privileging some aspects of a problem over others. Nelson and Oxley and Clausen back in 1997 showed that this impacts judgment through a priming effect. It influences what considerations, what information we consider, or what values is most accessible, most readable to mind, or what we give most weight to, what's most applicable. And the idea of the research shows that everyone frames. Whether you're a scientist writing a research grant proposal, a journalist, a politician, a member of the public, or even a teacher, you are often picking out certain aspects of an issue or a topic, highlighting some and downplaying others, trying to suggest what is most relevant, what's most salient for your audience. So we all do this packaging one sense or another. So there are some examples of framing research looking at basically how framing might interact with motivated cognition, reasoning, and values. For example, Kahan, again at Yale, and his colleagues in 2007, manipulated a proposed solution to climate change. People worked backwards from in terms of how they make sense of an issue and use their strongly held beliefs and attitudes towards an issue to then perceive evidence. Then what they did is they manipulated the possible solution to climate change. And when they manipulated the solution to be in line with different value predispositions, for example, they manipulated whether the solution to climate change was more anti-pollution regulation versus the solution to climate change was more investment in nuclear power from a business perspective, they found that conservatives or conservative orientations and value orientations people who held those were more supportive and more likely to believe in climate change when they proposed nuclear power as the solution, and liberals were more likely to believe in climate change when they proposed anti-pollution regulation. That changing the solution actually changed perceptions about climate change and the perceived risk from it. Druckman and Bolson did sort of a related study in 2011, basically presenting information about emerging technology. They had 3 experimental conditions. One where they just presented facts that said this is the scientific consensus on this issue, and just here are the facts. They created frames with facts, sort of embedding this information in sort of a framing narrative, and frames without facts. And they found that when you just present facts to people, they're more likely to process them in a motivated way. They're more likely to counter-argue the facts based upon their values and predispositions. However, frames were more effective in reducing counter-arguing and reducing the likelihood of using pre-existing values and beliefs to process information. And actually what they found that it didn't really matter whether you include facts or not. It was the framing doing all the work. All right, just to finish up here in the last few minutes, talking about, well, what's the implications for specific communication strategies of these public opinion trends and research that I've reviewed today? Well, there's sort of 4 areas, 4 ideas that I want you to sort of think about in terms of how you communicate climate change to the general public. One is identifying audience segments, matching message with audiences, and connecting to values. The second is recognizing our own ideological and value biases in terms of how we approach climate change, and that there's our value distance and social distance that we have to address in our communication and propose solutions. Third is how do we reduce motivated reasoning when we talk to the public. And third is really reducing the psychological distance between ourselves and our communication and the audience. When you think about audience segmentation, George Mason University, Ed Maybach, and Tony Lesowitz at Yale have really put out this great report calling sort of the Six Americas of global warming, right? Where they really sort of look at, through survey work and in-depth interviews, sort of segmenting the general public in terms of how they view climate change. Everything from the alarmed, which is about 12% of the public who are the highest belief in global warming, the most concerned, the most motivated, versus the dismissive, who have the lowest belief in global warming, who are the least concerned. And that way, by looking at this report, which I recommend, you can understand how to match different messages with different types of audiences, different needs of the audience, different motivations of the audience when they come to climate change. Kahan also, coincidentally at Yale, in the Cultural Cognition Project, also tries to segment the public by different value orientations. They say there's two sort of axes. One that believes in sort of more individualist approach to society, all right, that's more the individualist paradigm, versus the communitarian approach to society, where the putting the society as a whole over the individual. And then there's the hierarchical versus egalitarian, where there's people who believe that everyone has their place, and there's certain hierarchy and authority to society, versus those who focus more on promoting equality among all individuals in all groups. And really, when you look at different risks, those who score high on hierarchical individualists often perceive more economic risk compared to those who score on communitarian and egalitarian. They perceive more environmental risk. So when you're talking about climate change and global warming, possible solutions, possible issues, focusing and understanding whether people are going to attend to economic side of the equation versus the environmental side of the equation is important in terms of how you communicate the issue and basically cut through some of the motivated reasoning and value predispositions. Excuse me, I need a little water. Okay, almost done here. One thing I think is important to understand is our own biases. And people talk about the scientific establishment. And scientists are people too. And so we tend to forget that. And if you look at a recent survey of AAAS members, the Association for the Advancement of Science, it was done by Pew a couple years ago. They also did a survey of the public. You can see a large difference in the top panel of AAAS members in terms of what percentage are liberal and Democrat, versus the panel below is what percentage among the general public are also liberal and Democrat. And you can see there is an ideological and partisan divide, where AAAS members tend to be much more Democrat and liberal compared to the general public. And the size of the circles is the proportional size of that various population. All right? So the scientific establishment, all right, does have more liberal and democratic views toward political views in the general public. This can create some perception gaps, some perceived sort of ideological distance that often has to be closed on how you communicate. All right? So in terms of AAAS members in the general public, you can see they're almost as distant from the general public, which tend to be more Democrat but also more conservative, as Tea Party members are from the general public. So we need to understand our own ideological biases about how we talk about an issue, what aspects of climate change or global warming we decide to focus on versus what the public might be most concerned about. All right? So one step in being an effective communicator is understanding where you're coming from it so you can help bridge this divide. I've been doing focus groups in rural Ohio for the last few weeks on climate change and global warming, and really from that experience and from my own research, I believe starting the conversation is key. And we really need to refrain from what I call identity maintenance. Demonizing the other makes us feel good. We get pleasure for feeling somehow we're superior. and somehow that we reinforce our own identity as a liberal, as a Democrat, as a scientist. If we demonize Republicans, that somehow they just don't get it. They have a different brain from us, all right? So part of us understanding and bridging the political polarization is not to start talking about how Republicans are alternative realities, how they have a certain brain that's different from the liberal brain, but really understanding that partisanship and polarization is self-reinforcing. There's actually research out in psychology that shows the more extreme partisan you are, whether you're liberal or conservative, the more likely you are to perceive partisanship, and that this is a self-reinforcing spiral. So we need to sort of dismiss this type of perspective, stop trying to feel good about ourselves if we're trying to sort of demonize certain groups that might be more skeptical about climate science, and really sort of start the conversation, all right, by trying to bridge these differences. One way to do this is sort of reduce motivation and affective response to our messages. Global warming has become a very politicized term. And really, when you talk about it, climate change is more accurate, and research actually shows that people respond better, both Republicans and liberals, when you use the term climate change versus global warming because of the politicization around that term in the political discourse. We also maybe should think about moving the conversation away from mitigation, focusing on cap and trade all the time, and talk more about adaptation. Climate change is going to happen whether we like it or not. Even if we reduce emissions now, moving in the future, 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to see significant climate impacts. So focusing on prevention, capacity building, and community resilience is a way to sort of have that dialogue. Because 2/3 of Americans believe that global warming and climate change is happening. There's more disagreement, though, on why it's happening. But getting away from mitigation and talking about prevention, community resilience to climate change impacts hopefully starts a conversation that then can go back to mitigation in the long run. All right? So let's sort of shift the conversation to focusing on what we do agree about, which I think gets lost in this focus on the polarization, which is everyone wants to focus on adaptation, risk aversion, risk capacity building for dealing with long-term climate change. All right. And lastly, employing narratives to reduce counter-arguing. Research and communication has shown that when you communicate information in sort of an entertaining way or through infotainment, through like a documentary, for example, you reduce the likelihood of people who have strongly held beliefs to counter-argue the information you're presenting. So creating and presenting information in a narrative format offers an effective way to reduce motivated reasoning. One example project, one example of this is a study by Ed Maybach and his colleagues in 2010 that found that arguments focusing on health benefits of climate mitigation rather than the health risks were found to be more compelling and less polarizing among those different groups. Both alarmists and those who are concerned were more receptive to information focusing on the health benefits of addressing climate change rather than always talking about the downside and the health risks. All right? And this information was actually incorporated into a report called Conveying the Human Implications of Climate Change, which provides a primer and a guide, which I recommend for some of you in the health communication area, on how to communicate climate change to the general public. Lastly here, my last set of recommendations is about communicating concretely. What do I mean about that? In psychology, there's something called construal level theory that posits that we think about issues in either abstract or concrete terms, right? And the more abstract we think about something, the less risk we perceive. The more concrete, the more risk we perceive. So if you want to communicate the risks of climate change and global warming to a general public, you really have to reduce the psychological distance and make it more concrete. And construal level theory posits there's 4 forms of psychological distance. There's spatial distance, based upon whether the impacts of climate change, for example, are in the local community or overseas. Temporal, whether they're happening now or the far future. Social, whether it's happening to people like me or people who are very different from me, perceive social distance, like that study that I did with Saul on health impacts in-group, out-group, and hypothetical, whether it's going to happen or not. And by reducing the perceived psychological distance among these four dimensions, you can actually have people think about climate change among more concrete terms rather than abstract, as is often presented in the media, and actually then increase risk perceptions about the issue. So, what does that mean? Communicating my new mantra when I talk to people, when I think about this issue, is local, not global. All right? Talking about global climate change actually makes people think about it in more abstract terms. Talk about local impacts and link them to environmental issues which are more salient. As I discussed, climate change, global warming, is, though people worry about it, it's far down the list of actual more immediate or salient environmental concerns. But if you can link climate change and talk about it in your local community, for example, linking to water quality, you make people think about it in more concrete terms and actually will influence their opinions to a greater degree. Also talking about impacts not only on the local community, but people like themselves within the local community, focusing on people of the similar social, ethnic, racial, class, political background, actually will also reduce perceived distance. While you're talking about local impacts, though, obviously climate science is still evolving. And so we need to set, realistic expectations about our certainty about the information, about the severity of the potential impacts, and the time frame for these impacts. Otherwise, we have the risk of, if we create exaggeration about local impacts, we have the risk of future communication being tainted by that and people not really possibly dismissing communication about how climate change might impact the local community moving forward if we overstate our case. So we should try to communicate about local impacts based upon the best science possible. The good news is that when you reduce perceived social distance, perceived psychological distance on one dimension, whether it's spatial, temporal, or social, for example, it influences the perceptions of others. So reducing perceived distance on one dimension reduces perceived distance on all dimensions, that they're intertwined, okay? So focusing on reducing dimensions, psychological distance, can have an overall impact in having people think more concretely about the issue and then be more motivated and think about the risk implications of climate change. One example project of this, just wanted to sort of a shout out to an NSF-funded project I'm working on with many colleagues in the School of Environmental and Natural Resources here at OSU and other departments, focusing on the Maumee watershed in Ohio and Indiana and Michigan. And we're trying to focus on public perceptions about the local ecosystem. How do they make connections between water quality, climate change, and Lake Erie? How do farmers and stakeholders feel about it? How does the general public? How do policymakers? And what connections they see? We want to take this information and put it into different climate and ecological models to really understand what the potential impacts of different types of behaviors, environmental change will have on the local ecosystem in Lake Erie 10, 20, 30 years from now, and then understand how we can communicate these risks in a more concrete manner. How do we educate and motivate citizens about climate change through communication about adaptation and prevention? That this is what's going to occur. How does the local communities adapt, especially when it comes to water issues and runoff into Lake Erie, to changes in, for example, rainfall, temperature, growing season, or other potential climate impacts. So integrating the social and the biophysical, looking at this case study, we can draw lessons about how to communicate climate change to other similar communities. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry for going so long. It was a lot of information to cover, and I'd be happy to stay on as long as needed to answer any questions or comments that people might have.
Thanks, Eric. That was excellent. We did get a lot of questions, and we will stay on a bit longer, I think at least until 1:15 or so, give or take a few minutes. So if anybody has to leave now, we totally understand. We did get some great questions. I basically divided those into three categories: the trends, some of the research that you presented, and strategies. So what we'll do, we'll start with strategies. You presented a lot of great ones, and one that came up a few times was this idea of economics and linking. You mentioned linking things with people care about, and obviously you presented a lot of data about their interest in economic health. Can you talk more about how to work with both those concepts, environmental quality and economic prosperity?
Right. Well, in my personal opinion, I think one of the failures of communication about climate change, and when it comes to cap and trade and the carbon tax and other climate mitigation policies promoted by environmental groups and others, is that there hasn't been really a persuasive case made to the public, to the American public, about how sort of an economic persuasive case, that really the economic benefits of climate mitigation and addressing climate change and global warming need to be not only better communicated, but they need to be better developed. The idea that somehow green jobs will be an economic driver, we haven't really seen the fruition of that. And we've seen a lot of so-called green jobs, because of labor costs and others, really, grown in China. And so I think we need to sort of reframe the conversation about what government can do from a policy perspective to promote the economic benefits of climate mitigation. And I think we need to be careful at the same time, though, of overhyping green jobs. I think we still haven't quite figured that out. I think it's somewhat of a policy question, is how do we economically address this issue? And I do think that people will be more open to talking about the economic dimensions as the economy improves. If the economy significantly improves in the next 2, 3, 4 years, I think people will feel more comfortable talking about what the possible economic costs of climate mitigation policies would be. But in the short term, I think it's very difficult to link it to economic benefits, because those have not really been clearly identified nor been proven to be actually feasible. When it comes to health, I believe that focusing on health impacts and possibly economic at a local level is the best way to go. So each region of the country will have different types of health implications of climate change. And one of the efforts is identifying what those health implications are and communicating how climate change might worsen existing health concerns in terms of not only water quality, but asthma and air pollution, for example. So, understanding how climate change intersects with human health at a local context, I think, is key. And then you can design strategies that talk about climate adaptation and eventually climate mitigation to address those concerns. Those are some general thoughts on that issue, but there's more specific questions. I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, that was a good start for that question. We'll go back to the trends presentation portion of the presentation. Someone asked about the record-breaking March temperatures we've just had recently, and have you seen influences from events like that?
To a limited degree, but you're likely. Gallup does have some data out on there, and so does the Yale Center, and they conflict a little bit. But what you see in the research shows, there is research shows that, and looking over across years, there was some political scientists looked at Pew polls across a couple of years and actually coded on extreme weather events that happened plus or minus differences in normality of temperatures shortly before the poll was taken, and saw whether that impacted perceptions about global warming. And what it does, it did show that it had some impact, but again, we're motivated to either have those types of extreme weather increase our, what we call confirmation bias. We're motivated to process that information, if you will, about climate, about extreme weather events, to either confirm what we already think or dismiss it and disconfirm it. So though it might have an influence for some, in many cases it will be processed in a motivated way, just like many other types of information cues, where conservatives are more likely to dismiss it as purely as normal sort of natural variability, and liberals are more likely to use it as a confirmation that global warming is happening, getting worse. Now, I will say one thing in the focus groups that we're conducting, when we start having a dialogue, sometimes it's hard to actually understand some of these trends by simply looking at closed-ended top-level survey data. But in these focus groups that we're doing with general public in rural Ohio and urban Ohio, what we're finding is that when we talk to climate skeptics, the skepticism often among the general public is not that whether it's happening or not. They recognize, many, especially those involved in the agricultural industries, they recognize that something is occurring and that temperatures seem to get either warming or they're more variable. And that's another thing I think is key to communicate. It's not only about global warming, but it's about global variability and unpredictability. And that something is occurring. Now, whether that's due to natural causes or humans is still debatable. You won't convince them that it's indicator, warmer temperatures, an indicator that humans are causing global warming, but you might convince them that global warming is happening. But what that does, the benefit of that, even though they're skeptical of human-induced global warming, is it opens up a dialogue about adaptation, prevention, capacity building. So at least instead of going away pretty much or saying, oh, you don't believe global warming is happening, or you don't believe that global warming is human-induced, I'm not going to talk to you, you can say, you know what, we both agree something is happening, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to work in our local community to build capacity to deal with these changes that we're both seeing regardless of the cause? Eventually, it might actually increase education and mutual understanding where you can go back to talking about mitigation as well.
Okay, and we'll take one question here on the research itself. Is asking people to choose between economic development and the environment, how are they dealing with that in some of these surveys, and is that, in fact, sort of influencing what people say by seeing those put together like that?
What do you mean? Forcing people to choose? I mean, those questions are often asked on different surveys, but I think the key thing is if you ask people how important is the environment, how important is the economy, they often rate both those highly. But when it comes down to it, often there are trade-offs you have to make between the two. And so you really do need to force people to make a choice to really what do they prioritize, to really make them sort of choose something that's consistent with their ideology, values, or beliefs or knowledge. So, forcing people to choose something is actually the reality of the context, because if you don't force people to choose one or the other, they will rate everything high. Often people want it all, much like we see with our budget deficit. They want lower taxes, but they want to reduce the deficit. Well, something has to give, right? And that's the same true often when you have in terms of different environmental and economic trade-offs. And in most cases, when we talk about cap and trade, carbon taxes, there are going to be economic consequences of those policies. What we have not really identified or communicated are the offsetting economic benefits, and that's what people care about now, especially in the context of a recession.
Well, we'll flip back here to strategies. Some people ask specifically about what you would consider important for Ohio. You mentioned talking about local issues, health impacts. Is there anything else Ohio or Great Lakes related that you can see as important in a communication message on this topic? And then also, how much science would you include in these types of messages?
Well, that's a good question. When it comes to Ohio impacts, and I think I'm not a biophysical scientist, so I can't speak to all the various biophysical impacts. And that's a question actually I'm hoping to ask on a poll in May. What impacts do people perceive climate change possibly, how do they think climate change is going to impact them in Ohio? And you can talk about different, and if you go to the Yale website, they actually have a report on, it's based upon a national public opinion survey, not Ohio specific, on how people think climate change might impact them from an environmental economic perspective. But based on the focus groups we've done, based upon some of the survey data and national trends, I think people are very concerned about water quality, and not only water quality, but water availability. Often what I've seen in some of the focus groups, many people are worried about their water being taken to other regions which are having droughts. So they're worried because they see that news in the media about climate change impacting the Southwest, the lack of water because of warming temperatures, many actually people in Ohio are worried about a lack of water, either Ohio also experiencing droughts or Ohio's water being taken to be used in other states. In contrast to a lot of climate models, some science actually suggests that Ohio will be getting wetter, especially certain areas of Ohio, though it might actually come in more torrential downpours and create flooding. So that's another impact. Okay, other people concerned about not having enough water, but too much water in terms of flooding. Another impact is possibly forest fires due to severe heat. So there's various types of impacts, and they probably vary depending on the region of Ohio. And that's one of the things we're trying to get at, trying to match public concern and public perceptions, which we're still at the infancy of doing. This NSF grant we have is, we just started, it's a 4-year process, and we're not even through year 1 yet, and looking at doing some surveys and needs assessments through focus groups, et cetera, and matching it with the best science possible to understand what the impact on Ohio is. In terms of how much science you communicate, I think you can communicate science, but you have to put the science in context. I'm not saying don't communicate science. What I'm saying is you should communicate science, but always match it with certain values or contextual cues that align with your audience. So when you talk about the science, align the science with what you think, what the audience needs to know from their perspective, what they're concerned about, their sort of value and ideological orientations. And if you marry the science with the context, be a much more effective communicator than just providing the science.
Excellent. I really want to thank Erik again for his willingness to present today, and I'd also like to thank all of our participants for the excellent discussion and questions. I have to thank NOAA, the National Sea Grant College Program, Ohio State University's Department of Agriculture, Environmental, and Developmental Economics for funding this webinar. I do want to remind you about our evaluation. Jill just posted that. We'd really like you to take a few minutes to fill that out. We need that input. I'd also want to refer you to resources and an archive of all previous webinar presentations as well as this one, which are located on changingclimate.osu.edu. This webinar series, again, is sponsored by the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team and will continue next month on June 12th with a presentation by Alex Thompson, also of Ohio State University, who will be discussing the future of international treaties. Thank you again, Erik. It was an excellent presentation, and for all our webinar participants. We hope this was beneficial and that you'll join us again in June and for future webinars. Thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.